Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of Pod Save Chocolate. My name is Clay Gordon, and I'm your host today. And today we're talking about grading cocoa. What does it mean to evaluate cocoa beans, and how are the evaluations of beans expressed? Right now, the reason why I'm covering this topic today is because recently someone sent to me, a cocoa trader, sent to me, we sell grade A cocoa beans. And I said, what are grade A cocoa beans? I've never heard of that grading standard before. Is it something you made up, or is it a standard that comes from the country, the producing country that you're representing? And they said, well, it's not an official standard. It's just how we talk about it. And so I said, okay, let's talk about it. And then in the mail a little while ago, I received like a little envelope, and in the envelope was a little bag of beans. And this is a producer in Ecuador who's saying to me, hey, Clay, can you tell me about the beans that I'm growing? What do you think about them? And, I can cut one bean open and, what does one bean tell me? I can't, what does it all mean? What do I do? What's it all about? Right? And that's what we're going to be talking about today. But before we get there, what I want to remind everybody is that this episode of Pod Save Chocolate, like every episode of Pod Save Chocolate, is supported by the members of The Chocolate Life. If you're not a member, please go over to The Chocolate Life now. Here's the homepage of The Chocolate Life. I'm logged in. You can click this green button and it'll say join, and you can become a member of The Chocolate Life. There's always a free membership, but if you do have the resources to support the work that I do financially, I would really appreciate it. And for every episode of Pod Save Chocolate, I put together a post. And this is the post for today's episode. So if you're watching this not live, or even if you're watching it live, you'll have the option to go and visit each one of the reference links, all of the resources that I talk about here, so that you don't have to worry about finding the link during the episode. There's always this point of reference. And in the future, because this is a post on The Chocolate Life, you will have links to watch the archived episodes on YouTube, LinkedIn, and Facebook. Which reminds me that no matter where you're connecting today, whether it is from YouTube, LinkedIn, or Facebook, why don't you go into the live chat on YouTube or the comments on LinkedIn and Facebook and let me know where in the world you're connecting from. Now, I'll see whether you're connecting on LinkedIn, YouTube, or Facebook. That's not the issue. But where in the world? You're connecting from the United States, or you're connecting from outside the United States? Put it up in the comments. I'll get it up on the screen, give you a quick shout out, say thank you very much for connecting today. And if you have a question, any kind of question or comment about anything that I'm talking about today, put it in the comments too, and I will try to get it answered during the course of the episode. If not, what I will do is after the episode, I will go put it in the comments at the bottom, or maybe even create an entirely new episode, which has happened based on questions that people have presented during the course of an episode. So the first thing I want to talk about during today, so this is a run a show. In the overview, this is the run a show. What is quality? And so the important thing to remember in any discussion of quality is that there is no absolute definition of quality. There is no, this is good, this is bad, absolutely. The idea of what is good or what is bad, what is quality, is dependent upon a large number of factors and comes from the point of view of the person who's buying. So it's really all about, I open up my wallet, and quality is what I'm willing to pay for. Just really cool. So quality is a basket of attributes. Now, we might all have the same attributes in our baskets, but we're going to value those differently. So, for example, a large industrial producer are going to probably want to know two things. Number one, what is the price, right? And number two is, can I make a chocolate I already know how to make using these particular beans? And if the answer is no, I don't want to buy them because my definition of quality is about I don't want to includes ideas like I don't want to have to change my recipes in order to be able to use these particular beans. So quality is really, really interesting. We just can't say that, oh, just because it has genetics A, it's better than genetics B, or just because it has fermentation Z as opposed to fermentation X, it's better. They're all different. And each of these differences will suit the needs of some people and not the needs of others. Really, really important understanding to get there. So that's the review of quality that we're going for here, all right, or the definition of quality that I'm talking about. I want to do a quick shout out to Gordon South from Southwest Colorado and Peru Eco Farm. Gordon, I don't know if you're connecting from Southwest Colorado this morning or whether you're connecting from Peru, but welcome to this episode of Pod Safe Chocolate. And a quick shout out to Julie McLean from Raleigh, North Carolina. Now, people should know that Julie does offer, her business, Sibusura, does offer cocoa beans, primarily, I believe, from Ecuador, and Tanzania, I believe, but beans, butter, powder, nibs, other derivative products. And so this is a topic which she is very interested in, and we've had some discussions about. So before we go there, what is quality? So what are grading standards? I'm going to zoom this up a little bit. What are grading standards? So grading standards are typically, right, sets of criteria to determine how in a particular producing countries, how to define beans with specific characteristics. So in Ecuador, we'll get to. So in Ecuador, let me scroll through here. I do have an image that I want to show to everybody. So in Ecuador, ANACACAO is the Exporters Association. So in Ecuador, they have a grading standard, which is called ASE. And here we can see price differences. We have ASE, ASS, unfortunately ASS, ASSS, and ASSPS. And what these refer to are percentage of defects. The more defects there are in a bean, the lower the quote unquote quality, and therefore the lower the price. So this is what grading standards do. They set criteria for defects, and then they set limits on those defects. And a bean which has more defects, right, commands a lower price. And so beans that are the lowest quality may only work for cocoa butter, and beans that are of the highest quality, right, could be used for quote unquote specialty chocolate. Now it's interesting that CCN 51 here, at the time that this was done, right, was considered a separate classification. So it wasn't even, but it had the same price ratio. So at $45.36 per kilo, which sounds very expensive. Oh, this is US dollars. This is probably for quintals, I'm thinking, which would be about 100 pounds. This is the differential. So there was a discount of 96% of this price. This was 96% of this price. This is 102%. You get the idea. So there is a standard for defects, which is used to help determine the price. And that's the way that grading standards work around the world. And how do we determine what grade someone is, what a bean is? And that standard is primarily based around something called a cut test. And the cut test is pretty obvious, right? What we do is so here is a photo of a cut test. This one is being done in Nicaragua. This was done sometime between 2014, 2017. I'm there doing some classes, a week-long boot camp on cocoa quality with Ingeman. And this is the setup that they're doing for their cut tests. So they have a guillotine, a cocoa guillotine. They take a collection of 50 beans selected at random. They slice those beans in half, and then they perform a visual inspection. And what they're looking for is indications. So what kind of color the beans are, and I hate to do this, but this image here is the standard reference image, which was developed in the late 1980s at the Cocoa Research Center in Trinidad. And this is the reference image that's still being used around the world. But you get an idea about whether we're trying to tell from this reference image, we have an idea of whether the bean is slightly over fermented, if it's well fermented, right? We get an idea about, here's a pale bean, so it's well fermented. And so we have this reference image, and what we do is we have a person who is taking a look at this cross section of beans, right? And they're trying to determine if it fits into this category of well fermented, partially fermented, and there are differences based upon genetics. So if the bean might be an acriollado, which is a mix of Criollo and Trinitario genetics. So the Criollo went to Trinidad, it was crossbred with a Forastero, then it came back to Nicaragua, for example, and would have been that Trinitario would have been crossbred with local Nicaraguan genetics, that we would call that an acriollado. Also in Honduras, I understand as well. But we have all these colors, and we're trying to determine defects. What are the defects? Okay, so is the bean insufficiently fermented? So we might have a bean that is a slaty bean. Right? So this means that there is no fissuring. We can see the fissures here. There is no fissuring. A partially fermented would be incomplete fissuring of the bean. When a bean is slaty, it means there has been zero fermentation, right? And it will detract from the flavor components that the beans can produce, right? The rest of the beans can produce. It will often produce a sort of chalky, sort of metallic, sometimes stone-like flavor, right? So the higher percentage of slaty or under-fermented or non-fermented beans that we have, right, the lower the flavor potential for the rest of the beans. So that's what we're trying to do here, is determine. Another defect would be whether or not there was insect damage to the beans. So we can see that there is a hole which is different from where the germ or radical would be, where an insect has burrowed into the bean, perhaps left an egg sac behind. Maybe the bean, there's mold or mildew, which is visible on the inside of the bean because through improper drying. Those are examples of defects, right? And if I were to take a sample of, say, out of a 65 kilo bag, what I might do is I might take a sample of 100 beans selected at random. This is all statistical. I'm going to do that, and I'm going to do these percentages. Right? I might also take a look at the bag and then weigh the bag beforehand and then afterwards. And if there is trash, so there's sticks, twigs, stones, other things that aren't cocoa beans, that's going to be considered a defect as well. The higher the percentage of trash, the weight of trash in a bag of beans, the lower the quote unquote quality, the less I should spend for the beans. So this is what a cut test is for. It's a visual inspection of the beans using reference standards that let us know what we to expect in the beans and how do we grade that selection of beans. And if you're interested, there is this link to the UN library, and this particular link will show you the grading standards of cocoa beans by country. Now, I can't, you'll have to go download because you're not going to be able to read them here, but there is a link to this page and you can get an idea about, what the defect levels are in those beans, right? And you can see that, for example, right, in Ecuador, they have these 1, 2, 3, 4 different grading standards. These are all about defects. Now, it's also interesting to know that these don't care about the genetics of the beans other than the fact of it's CCN51 or not CCN51. So they don't really care about the genetics. They're talking mostly about fermentation here, fermentation and drying, right? So has it been properly fermented? But we're not talking about, is it pure nacional? That's not part of this. Is it an introduced hybrid, or is it one of the new hybrids that INEAP is doing? Does this equally apply to the T series, the T800, T01, which are the next generation of CCN51? So the grading standards really don't tell you much about the flavor potential of beans other than as related to the percentage of defects in the beans. And that's what That's what a cut test measures. So it doesn't really measure quote unquote quality per se. It doesn't tell you anything about the flavor of the chocolate that the beans will do. It's a measure of the defects, percentage of the defects in different ratios. Right? And I'm hoping it understands. If people are any confusion, let me know in the comments. This is what a cut test is. This is what a cut test is for. It is this visual inspection. Quick shout out again to Julie. She says, in addition to Ecuador and Tanzania, they have a liquor, butter, and powder from Peru. I believe there is a classified on the Chocolate Life. I'll put a link to the classified on this page later, so you can, if you're interested in what it is that she's offering, you can go do a quick shout out to her. And then also a quick shout out to Giorgia Martone from Bologna. And I hope I'm doing it. It's a Martone. I'm not entirely sure, from Italy. But I mean, Georgia, it's great to have you here. I want to let you, so, I was standing, I think it was Friday, in the press room at the Salon du Chocolat in New York, and Georgia approaches me. And I don't know that we'd ever met, but she walks over and she introduces herself and says she's been following the Chocolate Life for quite some time. And it was really, really fun. I did get a chance to meet some Chocolate Life members that I did not know beforehand at the Salon du Chocolat. So, and thank you, Georgia, not only for becoming a premium member of the Chocolate Life, but also for signing up as a member at the Chocolate Life forums, which I'm going to go there right now because that's a great segue. So for a long time, I've been talking about taking the Chocolate Life archive and opening it up so that people can, add to the forums and start using the classifieds again. And I did it yesterday. So if you're interested, you can find out by typing in your current email address if you're already a member. And if you're not a member, you can set up a new account. And the way you do that is, I'm going to log out. The way you do that is go to archive.thechocolatelife.com and then click on the create account button. And you can create an account and sign up and become a member. Now, I do need to approve all of those accounts. So it will take a while once I get the notification, but you will be able to go to the forums and contribute in the forums. I'm going to add a new classified section. The old classified section has been marked read only, so you can't add to it, but you get an idea about what's there. So it's a work in progress, but the goal here is that you can go and add content on your own. You don't need to wait for me to post it. And I'm also going to be opening up the classifieds so that if you'd rather post the classifieds on the forum site rather than on the main site, which is where I do the classifieds, I moderate them and I post them. You'll be able to do that as well. So that's new. And as of yesterday. So please go and do that. I mean, it'll be a lot of fun. I appreciate that, all that kind of stuff. So this is what a cut test looks like if you've never done a cut test. And one of the things that I learned, or one of the things that I was told when I was starting out, and this is in early 2003 when I made my first visit to a producing country. So this is Ecuador in 2003 with the University of Chocolate, which was organized by Pierrick Chouard, then of Vintage Chocolates. I started working for Pierrick distributing Cluizel and Domori in 1999 and continued to work with him selling Cluizel and Domori, I believe into 2005 or so, which is when I stepped back and started focusing on the Chocolate Life or Chocophile.com full time at that point. But we were looking at cut tests, and we were told that a cut test was a definitive measure of quality. If you didn't have 80% well fermented, it was low quality. If you had more than 1 or 2% slaty beans, so 1 bean out of 100 was slaty, or 2 beans out of 100 was slaty, or there was insect damage or there was mold and mildew, then it was low quality cocoa, right? And it didn't have any room for what are the genetics of the cocoa and anything else. And did 80% make sense, right, as a determinant quality for 80% well fermented? So out of 100 beans, 80% of them displayed the characteristics of complete or well or fully fermented, which meant fissuring for the most part. So was that what quality was really all about? And what we really need to do is go back and ask ourselves the question, what was the cut test created for? Why did the cut test come into an existence? And the answer to that question turns out to be pretty simple, right? Because so if I have a commoditized cocoa market, right, where a broker, say, sitting in a room in Chicago, or sitting in a room in Chicago, say they worked for, so say, Blommers at the time. They sit up and they can call somebody who's trading beans out of Cote d'Ivoire or Ghana, and they can say, I want 20 containers of beans, right, which have this quality level, right? And the quality level referred to the grading standard. So let's say the beans came from Ecuador, and what I want is ASSA beans, right? What the buyer can then do is he can rummage through their warehouse, find sacks of beans which have been designated ASSE, and just put them in a container and ship them, right? That's the point. And what the buyer wants to know is they will know about the distribution of fermentation and other defects that might be present at that grading level. So what they can say is, will the beans make a chocolate I already know how to make? Right? If there is a different distribution of fermentation, or there's a different distribution of defects, a higher percentage of slaty beans, for example, or something like that, right? In addition to, instead of it 80% well fermented, it's 75% well fermented, right? The buyer will know that those beans cannot be used in a recipe to make a chocolate they already know how to make. That's why the cut test was invented. It wasn't invented to determine these are good quality beans or these are bad quality beans. It was invented to say, how to do a quick visual test which will enable someone without a whole lot of training and without a whole lot of understanding, to go look at beans and say, oh, here's the distribution of fermentation, and here is the distribution of defects. That's what the cut test was invented for. Quick and easy test, a visual test, to be able to establish according to some set of criteria, which would determine this statistical distribution. That's what it's for. That's what it is. That's what it's all about. It doesn't really tell you anything. It's not that it doesn't really tell you anything. It doesn't tell you anything about the kind of chocolate that is made. And in fact, it's based on the research that Ingemann and many other people have done. It's based on the assumption that 80% well fermented is the standard that we should be looking at, right? So if I've got then a criollado, something which is a high percentage of criollo genetics, and I'm looking to be able to get the sort of delicate fruit flowers and other flavors that might be in that bean, a quote unquote proper, right, level of fermentation might be 50%. It might be 55%, right? Because as the bean continues to ferment, what we're doing is we're altering the chemical composition of the bean. And if we alter the chemical composition of the bean, we hit a peak. And then after that, we're cooking out the flavors other than cocoa and chocolate, right? There might be fruit and flowers flavors which have disappeared because we're fixated on this 80% well fermented metric. And that's one of the most interesting things that I learned doing this work with Nicaragua, is that they would send beans to highly respected chocolate makers. They'd do a cut test. They'd say, oh, this is only 60% well fermented. The quality is bad, right? And therefore, we don't even want to do the work of roasting them and tasting the chocolate that they make from the beans. It's just that it doesn't meet this arbitrary standard of 80%, which is apropos of absolutely nothing, except for industrial chocolate, right, made in bulk, in which the primary component of flavor is just cocoa flavor, chocolate flavor. If I want to deliver just this standard chocolate flavor, which is associated with West African Amelinado forastero, then 80% well fermented as a benchmark is a pretty good one. Right. But if what I want is delicate flowers and all these other spices and floral notes and things that I can get out of cocoa beans, it turns out that 80% well fermented is not a good indicator of quality. Now, I also want to talk about something which is not obvious here. right? And it's never obvious in any photo of a cut test, which you can see. So, here is a photo of a cut test, right? And I'm going to bet you anything you want to know that the lighting conditions that the evaluator is looking at these beans under in this photo was different from this photo. So we have a whole bunch of variables when we're looking at a cut test. Now, I know for a fact, because I took this photo, that this is in a warehouse in Nicaragua. It's late afternoon. There are no lights on in the warehouse, and all this light that's coming in is natural sunlight coming in through windows, which are about 8 feet above the floor, and they're not huge windows. But this is natural illumination at a particular kind of day, getting towards the golden hour, right? So it's perhaps slightly yellower in color than it might be at a different time of day, right? And I don't know what the level of illumination, I don't know what the lux is, I don't know how much light. So we have a different color temperature of light on this cut test, and we have a different amount of light which is cut on this cut test. If I were to shutter all the windows and turn on fluorescence, right, I could have daylight fluorescence or cool fluorescence. Different color temperatures are going to affect our perception of the color of the beans, right? I'm colorblind. I am slightly red-green colorblind. My evaluation of these beans is going to be different from someone who is colorblind in a different way or is not colorblind at all. And so we have this huge set of variables around lighting. Now, as this was taken by a digital camera, right, and I know that I probably processed it through Photoshop or Luminar Neo, which is the other application that I use, that I might have played with optimizing the color values for screen display, right? And so that's another, if I take pictures, it's another level of abstraction. So one of the challenges with cut tests is there, to the best of my knowledge, no standards of illumination under which the test is supposed to be performed. And so I could take the same beans and move them from one environment to another environment, and I might run up with a very, very different evaluation, right? So cut test, it turns out to be valuable in the sense that I can look at fissuring. I can look at fissuring as an indicator of fermentation. I can look perhaps at color change, right, if I know what the beans look like fresh, right? And then I can take a look at other defects, mold, mildew, insect damage, mildew, not mildew, mold, mildew, and insect damage, physical defects, and take a look at things. But it won't tell me anything about what the flavor potential of beans is going to be. And again, while I say this makes an enormous amount of sense when I'm doing when I'm doing, commodity chocolate using commodity beans, or industrial chocolate using commodity beans, if you are a specialty chocolate maker, right, you're a craft chocolate maker using specialty beans, the cut test and 80% well fermented is not an indicator of quality. It's an indicator of defects. It's not an indicator of quality, right? And the question becomes, are you evaluating these beans to find out if the distribution of fermentation and defects says, oh, right, I used these same beans from the same producer last year and it had the same distribution, and therefore chances are if I roast them the same way, I'm going to get a chocolate that tastes pretty much the same. That's what the cut test is all about, right? And as I say, excuse me, I have to be careful about where I move my cursor. If I'm not paying attention, I can bump the shared image off the screen. So back. That's why it disappeared for a few seconds. It came back again. So I'm spending a lot of time talking about the cut test because it's hugely important for this reason. If you are using the cut test as an evaluator of quality, and you believe that 80% well fermented is the benchmark for quality, you're not using the cut test properly unless you are an industrial producer using commodity beans, and your goal is to make a chocolate you already know how to make. If what you're doing is you are trying to understand a specialty bean, right? So with a specialty fermentation, right? Then what you want to do is you want to look at the cut test in a slightly different way. So, for example, if you're buying beans from Nicaragua, from Ingaman, and you're buying Opayo or Rugoso or Nicoliso or any one of those, it may turn out that their distribution of fermentation is much lower. And the reason why is they're looking for a bean where they haven't cooked out the flavor chemicals into cocoa and chocolate, but you're going to get the potential for fruit and flowers and spices and other kinds of things. So if you are a specialty, if you are a craft chocolate maker using specialty beans, you need to come up with a different method in order to be able to determine if a bean is a quote unquote quality bean. Now, you may do a cut test because you're looking for defects. How many slaty beans are there? How many, really, really under fermented beans are there? Is there any mold and mildew damage? If your contract allows, right, say, if they're moldy and mildewy beans above 2%, I get to reject, and I don't owe you any money for these beans and you have to take them back, right? You can say that to your supplier. That would make sense for a cut test, right? To determine if there's physical damage that might make these beans unusable, right? But if you're going to try to determine whether or not these beans will make good chocolate, you have to come up with a different method. And what I'm going to suggest is that the method that gets used, right, is based around organoleptic grading. And in this respect, what I want to propose is that we take a look at specialty cocoa the way we look at specialty coffee. So in the world of specialty coffee, the SCAA, the Specialty Coffee Association, and the Specialty Coffee Association of America, the definition of specialty is around, does this coffee bean make good coffee? So they will roast the beans, they will have certified graders, Q graders, they'll cup the coffee, and they will make a determination. Does this coffee bean make a good cup of coffee? And if the score is above a certain percentage, by a certain number of certified graders, then the answer is this bean can be considered to be a specialty bean as opposed to a commodity or bulk bean. And what I propose is that the cocoa world move in that direction, right? If you are a specialty maker, if you're a craft chocolate maker using specialty beans, what you want to do is you want to base your decision on whether or not this bean makes good chocolate. This cocoa bean makes good chocolate. And so the question becomes, are there any programs that do that right now? And the answer is absolutely yes. There is a program, that does that right now, and it's the Cacao of Excellence. Right? They have a contest every year, every other year, in which producers from producing countries submit their beans, and then a panel takes the beans, right, does some initial evaluation on the beans as sort of triage. From experience, they can say there are characteristics of this bean that we believe means it needs more work, right, in order to be able to be considered for specialty designation. And then what they will do is they will transform the beans into chocolate. And if you go to the info and resources page, what you'll be able to do is you'll be able to find out what all of these criteria are, right? And they'll be able to tell you how to go and roast the beans based upon the genetics. There's a very, 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 very detailed methodology which has been developed. And what they're doing here with the Cacao of Excellence program, formerly Cocoa of Excellence, what they're doing is they're saying the same thing. Does this cocoa bean make a good chocolate? And if the answer is yes, then what we'll do is we'll give it a specialty designation. We'll bring it into the Cacao of Excellence at a certain level. So if you can go and find a bean which has been produced by any winner in the Cacao of Excellence, what you do is you know that that bean, right, because of the evaluation has been done, can make a good chocolate. Now, there's another program. It's the Heirloom Cacao Preservation Fund, and they have a similar. The methodology is almost identical because, in fact, it was created by Ed Seguin, Darren Suka, and a small team, which is the same group who's been developing this, or among the core group of people who have been developing the Cacao of Excellence program. right? And what the Heirloom Cacao Preservation Project is done as Cacao of Excellence is they look at a bean, they transform the bean into chocolate, and they say, ooh, this is an interesting chocolate. These beans produce chocolate, which is, number one, specialty characteristics. But then what we're looking at is saying these beans deserve to be preserved. And what they will do then is they will do a genetic analysis on the beans. And they will say, well, we think it's this kind of hybrid because we know what else is growing in the area where the bean is growing. But what we're going to do is we're going to do this genetic analysis and we're going to find out precisely what the parentage of this bean is. If there are Criollo genetics, what percentage of Criollo genetics? If there is Melanado Forastero parentage, what that percentage of parentage is. And so that is a really, really important correlation that gets made. These beans make good chocolate, and here is the genetic parentage. Here's the parentage of those beans. And what we can do is we can start putting together a database, right, which connects the organoleptic evaluation with the heritage of the beans. Really, really important thing to do, right? And I noticed here that the Heirloom Cacao Preservation Fund is not listed here. I'll put them under the Cacao of Excellence after this episode is over. Now, if you are interested in understanding more about the cut test, there is an ISO standard on it. There's a link to it. You'll notice that it costs 132 Swiss francs, right? And you can get it in a bunch of language. We can read the sample, we get a forward and an introduction, and we do get a whole bunch of, right, what is defects, what is foreign matters, what is the germinated beans, what is well fermented. There's a set of definitions around here. If you want actually what the actual protocol is for doing a test, you need to pay the 132 francs in order to be able to get a copy of the standard. But there is, right, an ISO standard around cocoa grading. I believe there are also standards that there's the Federation of Cocoa Commerce, which is based in London. I believe that they have a grading standard document. I believe there's also something that's used by at the Mercantile Exchange in Chicago or by the Cocoa Association of the United States. That's not the name of it. That's just the name that I'm remembering. And there are those tool books that you can use to say, oh, this is how we do a cut test here, right? So you can go and do some more research to find them for yourself. But I'm going to suggest that the long-term future of what we're doing is to go and take a look at the approach that the Cacao of Excellence and the Heirloom Cacao Preservation Fund, right, focus on, which is, oh, these beans make good chocolate. These beans make good chocolate. It's exactly the same concept as is used in specialty coffee. These specialty beans make specialty coffee beverages, right? And if it's not specialty, it's considered commodity or bulk, right? And we're not really, that's the important, we don't care about the genetics, right? We don't care about where it was grown. We don't care about what the fermentation is. We don't care about all of that stuff. What we care about is, does this bean make good coffee? Does this bean make good chocolate? And can we characterize the flavors in the chocolate, which is different, right? Because for the most part, people don't eat cocoa beans. I'm dropping. People don't eat cocoa beans. I mean, maybe we cook nibs, but we don't eat cocoa beans. We eat chocolate, right? And so what we want to do is we want to evaluate the chocolate beans organoleptically, right? Then evaluate the beans sort of abstractly, right? So who cares if it's 80% well fermented, if it's, if it makes quote unquote crappy chocolate, right? For a specialty chocolate maker, for a craft chocolate maker, it makes no sense, right? So it's a long way of going around this. So good chocolate is made from good cocoa beans. Specialty chocolate is made from specialty cocoa beans. And then we can say, oh, what are the genetics of these beans? And we might say, oh, what is the fermentation protocol from these beans? We know that this genetics fermented this way will make good chocolate. Yay, it's fun, right? And then it's up to me as a chocolate maker to determine, I'm going to take the potential which was represented by those tests, those evaluations that others have made, and I am going to express them through my aesthetic lens as a chocolate maker. Because that's it's my goal to take these beans and go, ooh, here's an opportunity for creative expression. I get to take these beans and make chocolate from them. And I may not roast them exactly the same way that the Cacao of Excellence people are going to do, and I may not use exactly the same recipe that the Cacao of Excellence people did, but they needed to set a standard somewhere. This percentage, this kind of sugar, roasted this way, refined for this long, all of those things says, oh, we can, right? If we control for these variables closely enough, we can say the differences in the chocolate come from the beans, not from the process of making the chocolate, which is another important thing. We need this work to be done. And in that respect, right, the world of coffee is decades ahead of the worlds of cocoa and chocolate. And it's the direction we need to go. Now, if you want to know more about things, we have reference data sets which have to do with class beans that are used for classification, image data sets here. You can go and take a look at all of these resources and get an idea about what you might need to know if you wanted to do a much more technical evaluation. But what I want to do now is talk about current tech and a proposed ideal method going forward. So the current technology that is used, right, is special kinds of ovens and a specific refiner and a specific protocol used to transform beans into chocolate of a specific percentage. And it's always dark chocolate that we're evaluating. The beans in the dark chocolate and a very specific sugar, which is a low volatile sugar. It is a special sugar that they use for this because they don't want the sugar imparting the flavor into the chocolate. They want to make sure that there is none. So it's a very carefully considered idea. Now, what I can do, and this is what can be done, and this is another step, is that people like Zoe Papalexandratou, who is the woman who I learned most of what it is that I learned when I was working on this project in Ingeman between 2014 and 2017, right, have been taking an analytic technique called gas chromatography, HPLC, high performance liquid chromatography. And what they're doing is they're saying, oh, these beans make interesting chocolate, and we know what the genetics are. Let's perform HPLC on this and see if we can identify the chemicals, so the chemicals that contribute to aroma and taste. What are the chemicals in the beans that contribute to flavors? And so what we can do is we can notice, for example, a spike in a particular chemical, which we know is associated, for example, with, say, a tropical fruitiness, right? And we go, oh, right, that tropical fruit note is in the chocolate, which is made from this cocoa beans, right? And now we have this correlation between the chocolate that is made and the chemistry of the cocoa bean. And then we can connect that to genetics, right? And that's really, really cool. I think that's an important thing to do more of. Every bean that goes through the Heirloom Cacao Preservation Fund project, every bean that goes through the Cacao of Excellence, every bean. So this is a project that Zoe's been working on at MoCA, maximizing opportunities in coffee and cocoa in the Americas. So this is something that Zoe and the team have been doing for the MoCA project, funded in part, I believe, by Lutheran World Relief. It was originally within Lutheran World Relief, but has been spun out. But I think that this represents sort of the next generation of understanding and evaluating and expressing flavor is by taking this understanding of this beans make good chocolate, then going back, getting the genetic profile, so doing the SNMPs, single nucleotide polymorphism, the SNP test on this to understand what the parent genetics are for the cocoa bean, and then also doing this HPLC, this high performance liquid chromatography, right? In order to understand, what is the chemical basis, right? Which contributes to the flavors that we're getting in the finished chocolate. What this suggests that in future we might be able to do just be an HPLC test on the beans and go, oh, this bean has the potential, right, to produce chocolate with the following flavors in it, right? So that's a pretty cool idea, is to say, oh, there's now a test, not a cheap test, but there's now a test, a lab test, which can be done. It's not a visual test, but it's a lab test which can be done to help us understand, right, the chemical compounds in a bean that contribute to the flavor of chocolate. Now there's another, it's a related test. It does a different thing. It's called mass spectroscopy. So that's another analytic test which can be done, which will provide us a different view of the chemistry of the cocoa bean. Really, really interesting. So if I have mass spec plus HPLC plus the genetics on this, I can do a really, really interesting idea, get a really interesting, very, very specific notion of the flavor potential of beans, which is not related to a cut test, right? Which is very, very interesting, I think, for people. And why now? Well, the price of cocoa right now is high. It's, somewhere in the $7,500, $8,000 a ton, which is what, 2.5 times what it was, 2 years ago. There's money there, right, to be able to perform these tests right now to understand what's going on, right? And that wasn't the case when the price was a fraction of what it was now. Why not go through now, right, and understand, oh, this is what the chemistry of the beans is, and it might provide an objective measure to be able to say that, oh, the flavor potential of these beans is X. We can define what specialty is, right, based not just on an organoleptic evaluation, but an understanding of the chemistry of the beans, to understand that this truly is a specialty cocoa bean capable of producing a specialty chocolate. Now, which I think it may not be the holy grail, but we're sort of getting to we can now, for example, understand we have a bean which we are hybridizing because we want it to be more resistant to insects and other pests, as well as fungal and other diseases in cocoa. But we don't know how that's going to affect flavor. So we can do is fairly early in the cycle do an evaluation of the beans that this particular hybrid produces to say that, yes, this is truly a flavor bean, right? So that would be a way that I would take this information and use it with an understanding of the genetics. Right? So we can use genetic testing, to be able to determine whether a desired trait that we're looking for in the breeding process breeds true. But now we can use these other analytic techniques to say that not only do these traits breed true, but the chocolate that these beans produce, these beans are capable of producing superior tasting chocolate, which I think, works towards how do we combine breeding for productivity? How do we provide breeding for disease resistance? How do we take those things which we want in order to make sure that we have enough cocoa trees to produce the amount of cocoa that we need for the chocolate, right? And say, how do we preserve better tasting chocolate? How do we make sure that the beans are not just disease resistant and are not just climate resistant, right? But they also make good tasting chocolate. We need to do those two things together. And these techniques do those things. I think that another thing needs to be done, right, is to the cut test does have value, but I think that the cut test needs to be updated, and the reference image, this reference image here, needs to be updated using modern digital photography techniques. We need to go and use a very specific lighting standard at a specific brightness, at a specific color temperature in a tent, using a specific, sensor, using color reference, right, tools to be able to generate digital files that are reproducible. So I can print something which is the same color all the time, no matter where in the world it is printed. I can calibrate a monitor, and I can calibrate the monitor so that the colors represented on the monitor are the same, no matter where in the world this is being done. We want standardized reference tools. And the technology in terms of digital photography, print reproduction, are now so much better than they were, right, in the 1980s, when this image was produced. And I don't know that I've ever seen an original copy of this. I've only seen copies of copies. And so most people I know are training for these cut tests using a copy of a reference original, which means they don't actually have a reference original. They're working from something else. And so, if I'm doing a bad color photocopy of a bad color photocopy, there's a challenge there to begin with, right? And so I think that there is value in the cut test for some segments of the industry. But what we need to do is we need to modernize the reference image. We need to take these images, and we need to do not just fermented cocoa beans, but we also need, I think, to do raw cocoa beans. So this is what a raw cocoa beans look like. This is the transformation. This is what it looks like after 72 hours of fermentation. This is what it looks after 96 hours of fermentation. So you can see the progression of color and fissuring to understand what things are. We have the technology. It's so much better now. And this is something, I have a background in this. In my computer graphics world, I worked with color electronic prepress systems, and I understand the promises of digital photography and digital printing techniques, and the way they have evolved. Short-run digital printing today is just so good, right? That you can, in fact, produce digital originals, which you can reproduce with astonishing precision. And so we need to take this. I have no idea what the lighting condition was. I have no idea, right, what the colors I'm supposed to be looking for are, and be able to put something together which is repeatable. And you'd actually have a light tint, right? And you do that light, you get this light tint, and it'd have a bulb in it which output a very specific color at a very specific brightness, and you'd hold the cut test at a very, very specific distance from the lights, and you'd go, oh my gosh, now I can evaluate the color of these things, right, properly, right? Which would be very, very cool. But that's not cool enough. That's not cool enough. Combining this improved cut test and reference image with the organoleptic evaluation with HPLC and mass spec, right, would be fabulous. I would love all of those things. But there's one more thing we can do, which I think has perhaps groundbreaking applications. And that is the notion of what's called hyperspectral imaging. So hyperspectral imaging doesn't just use white light. It might use white light and infrared and ultraviolet, and it might use different wavelengths of both infrared and ultraviolet. Excuse me. And what you're going to do is you're going to take a photograph of a cocoa beans under lots of different lighting conditions simultaneously. Now, and at various angles of incidence, right? And what that is going to do is it's going to give you a color profile, a reflected color profile, an image from the sensor, which contains a lot of different data. And among other things, what you can do is you can do fingerprinting. You can say, oh, beans from this part of Peru, let's say Piura, produce a hyperspectral imaging profile of bean that is very, very different from beans from the Chuncho area of Peru down near Cusco, irrespective of fermentation, right? And you can go, oh, somebody's trying to pass off, Pura Gran Blanco for something else, or something else for Pura Gran Blanco. Or what you may do is you may find the beans from Ghana or beans from Cameroon are going into Nigeria, and they're being passed off as Nigerian beans, and they're not. So one of the things that hyperspectral imaging can do is it can provide you with a method to fingerprinting. And the great thing about that is if you have a phone, right, and it has a sensor attached to the phone, probably from here, you can take an image of a bean and you can compare it against a reference database. You don't need a super expensive. You've got a device which connects to your phone. It's a relatively inexpensive sensor, and it'll take a picture of the bean, and it will tell you a lot about that cocoa bean right there. And it could be, if right, taken to the next level, a complete replacement for a cut test. Right? And it could provide digital fingerprinting to let us know about counterfeiting or smuggling, and other things like that. It could let us know lots of other things. Could it let us know the fat content of bean? Maybe. Right now, soxhole extraction tests to understand the fat content of a bean are very expensive and time-consuming. Is there a way to be able to reduce that cost? Hyperspectral imaging might be able to do that for us. It might be able to get us to, other understandings of the chemistry of that particular bean in terms of the fat content. So oxidation levels of fats, right? Those are other things which could probably be done using hyperspectral imaging. And it's not a new thing. It's something actually I've been talking about with colleagues of mine for years about taking this kind of technology. It's not inexpensive. You do need to do it in a lab. You do need to set up a reference database. This is sometimes called near infrared imaging. In order for NIR to work, you do need to have a reference database of scans. But here's what a white light image is. Here's what this thing looks like under hyperspectral imaging. It provides you just with a very, very different look at the beans. And right now, what I think I'm going to say is that when we take this notion of hyperspectral imaging and white light imaging and then combine it with neural network evaluation. So we train an AI on it, right? This is used for evaluating aromas. So here's a neural network based electronic nose for cocoa beans quality assessment. Now, one of the things that I learned from Ed Seguin, right, about doing cut tests is when you have the beans in a guillotine, right? One of the things that you want to do, let me get rid of this electronic nose image. So if you're doing a cut test and you have a guillotine where you're cutting 50 beans at a time, what you want to do is when you open the guillotine up, what you want to stick your nose in it and just do a deep breath as you open up the guillotine, right? So that that will tell you a lot about what the beans will produce, what the flavor potential of the bean is. It's really quite remarkable. You could take two different beans, an 80% well-fermented Amelinado Forastero out of West Africa, and then you can take a 55% fermented Acriollado from Ingaman, and you do this, and they smell entirely different. And it turns out that aroma is an indicator of what the flavor potential of the beans is. So we want to get past this very, very, very simple visual inspection of cocoa beans, which is represented by the cut test, and we want to get to more elaborate assessment of the cut test, because I don't care whether it's 80% well fermented or 75% well fermented or 85% well fermented. I don't care. I don't believe in that standard. This is what the cut test was designed for. Is this distribution of fermentation, is it the same as the beans that I bought last year from the same place? And if it is, I know I can make a chocolate that tastes the same. I don't care about that, right? What I want to know is I want to know about the flavor potential of the beans. And if I'm going to get there, I need to use an entirely different set of evaluation techniques, and I need to have a different methodology, and I have to have a different end goal in mind in order to be able to make these assessments, right? And so how do we go about doing that? And I think we go about doing that by just, number one, understanding what the cut test was invented for, what its limitations are, and what are the other tools and approaches that we might use and we might advocate for going forward. A lot of this stuff is in the research lab, I understand, but a lot of it is out there in the public using HPLC, high performance liquid chromatography, right, is being used at the Mocha project specifically. It's probably being done internally by big industrial chocolate makers as a tool to help them understand changes in beans, right? But when it comes to the world of craft chocolate, when it comes to the world of specialty chocolate, right, I think we should care about whether or not the beans make tasty chocolate, right? We should focus less on fermentation, or percentage of fermentation is represented by a cut test. Right? It's important to understand that the same bean grown in different places will produce a different chemical profile, which leads to different flavors in chocolate. But I don't necessarily know that we should obsess about them in some of the ways that we do. I mean, I don't think there is a generic flavor profile for Ecuadorian cocoa. It's the sense that we can say, oh, these cocoa beans came from Ecuador, right? Or these cocoa beans came from Peru. Right? You need to have, you'd have to specifically have tasted those beans from that location and have a phenomenal flavor memory to get there. Right? And this is why I don't think that evaluation programs like the one that FCCI produces to evaluate the flavor of cocoa beans, I think that what it does is it helps you understand if the beans are defective. I don't necessarily know that it helps you understand if the beans make good chocolate. And those are, while understanding if the beans are defective, right, is an admirable goal. You don't want to waste the time and the resources to take these beans and do the next stage. So I think that is an admirable goal. But I don't think that eating a cocoa bean necessarily is going to tell you anything about the way the chocolate is made, especially if it's roasted very, very differently. There's a, if you're just, putting a ground up cocoa bean into water to smell it, that does provide you with something. But until you add sugar and grind the sugar into it, it's an incomplete understanding. It might tell you this bean is interesting or it's not, but it doesn't tell you anything about what the flavor potential of the bean is. And eventually, when we get right down to it, that's what we want to know. That's what I want to know. I want fabulous, fabulous tasting chocolate, and that's part of what it is that I'm doing right now. I'm finishing up. Unfortunately, I went to New York for the salon. It interrupted my judging for the Craft Chocolate Challenge. I came back. I had a stomach thing, which has been interfering. So I'm finishing up my judging of the Craft Chocolate Challenge. I care about whether these beans make interesting tasting chocolate that I want to have again and again and again. And hopefully that's what you want as well. And so I will add a couple more resources onto this post so you can go find them. I've got the one for the Heirloom Preservation Project. I want to organize things a little differently. I will put them into this page. If you know of other resources that should be on the page, and if you are a member of the Chocolate Life, you can go down into the comments. How come there's no comment section? Oh, here we are. You can put a comment on this page. Let me know what you think. Right? Happy to go follow up if you have other questions after the episode. That's a really, really important thing. This is the homepage of the Chocolate Life now. If you're not a member, this episode of Pod Save Chocolate, like every episode, is sponsored by you, the members of the Chocolate Life. I don't do advertising, not doing Patreon. Well, I do advertising, but it's only for chocolate-related stuff. Don't do network advertising of unrelated stuff. I don't allow network advertising so people can track you around the internet. That's not allowed. Not doing Patreon. Everything is associated with becoming a member and showing your support here. And then, of course, we have the new Chocolate Life Forum site, which is the old archive site. I actually haven't changed the URL. I'm not going to change the URL. But it's now open for new signups. And over the course of the next couple of days, especially over the course of this weekend, there'll be a new forums place where you can post your own classified, and we'll set things up. And we'll get it up and running, so that you don't have to rely on me. You don't have to wait for me to post things on TheChocolateLife.com. And with that, that's the end of today's episode. Thanks everybody for being with me today. And again, if you remember the Chocolate Life, you can go to the post for today and ask questions, make comments, let me know what you think. If you follow me on LinkedIn, you can do the same thing on my post on LinkedIn or the post on Facebook. Those are all places where you can get to me, and I do respond to the questions that are asked. And it's Tuesday, April 8th. I don't really have an idea for what the episode for this coming Friday is going to be. I am going to start scheduling the episodes of interviews and tastings with makers that I met with at the Salon du Chocolat. I've got 6 or 7 or 8 of them that I'm going to be doing over the course of the next couple of weeks. I have to get through all the judging for the Craft Chocolate Challenge first. There's a lot of chocolate to go through, and I have a tender stomach, so it's going much, much slower than I had hoped. But I'm going to close this episode of Pod Save Chocolate like I close every episode, to remind you that if you're working with chocolate and you're not having fun, you might want to reconsider your life choices, because you're doing it wrong. And with that, everybody, ciao until the next time.